Hello, everyone. Welcome to Sitheads Meditation Club. My name is John. I help organize this group. Sitheads is a sitting and social group for people interested in deep meditation practice. Everything we do is free and donation-based. And if you want to hang out with us, you can find us at sit-heads.com. With all that out of the way, it is my absolute pleasure and privilege to introduce our esteemed, august guest, Sharon Salzberg. Hi, Sharon. Is it okay if I bring you up?
Yes, of course.
It's really nice to see you again, Sharon.
And nice to see you.
Thank you. Do you mind if I do the sort of traditional speaking about you in the third person introduction?
No, it'd be really interesting to listen.
All right, here it goes. Sharon Salzberg is a living legend, one of the great Western meditation teachers. Back in the 1970s, Sharon co-founded the Insight Meditation Society and helped basically start the mindfulness movement in the West. And Sharon is also one of the main forces behind the spread of metta, or loving kindness meditation, in the West, in the sort of modern Western mainstream. Sharon is the author of 13 books, including the New York Times bestseller, Real Happiness, and her signature book, Loving Kindness. Although I don't know, it may be threatened for dominance by the sort of Real Blank series, right? Real Happiness, Real Love, Real Life. It may be coming for the crown. Sharon studied Vipassana meditation with 20th century legends like the great Dipa Ma, Anagarika Munindra, S.N. Goenka, and Sayadaw U Pandita. And later she studied Zogchen with the Tibetan masters Tsoknyi Rinpoche and Mingyur Rinpoche. And I'm sure she's had many other teachers that I didn't mention. Sharon, it is really, I'm just so happy to see you. It's always really a pleasure to hang out with you. Is there anything that you want to say before we get started with our sort of interview portion?
No, I'm really glad it's an interview. So
What, instead of like a talk?
instead of a talk, exactly.
Mhm. That's how we lure teachers to hang out with us. We tell them you won't have to prepare anything.
That's
Make it
right.
easy. So I spoke to you, back in Barrie a couple of years ago. We were hanging out, and I asked you what your practice is like. What are you doing? And you said, well, it's a lot of Zogchen. Um, and I was surprised to hear that because even though I saw you give a talk with Tsoknyi Rinpoche once, you're not really associated with Dzogchen practice. For anyone who doesn't know a Tibetan style of meditation, or you might say non-meditation, a sort of esoteric, non-dual Tibetan practice considered the pinnacle teaching of one of the four Tibetan schools, a teaching that was kept secret for a long time and is being taught a bit more widely now. So I just feel like there's such a rich vein to mine here because you're doing Dzogchen in your practice, but you don't really teach it. You're still teaching, to the extent that I'm aware, Vipassana, metta, and Buddhist practice and thought rooted in the Southeast Asian Theravada tradition of Buddhism, not the Tibetan tradition. So I guess like my first question, I have more detailed questions, but the first question is just sort of like, what's up with that?
Okay, well, it's kind of a wide-ranging answer, which would involve a lot of looking at Vipassana or insight meditation and also metta. So my first teacher was in India, January 1971, when I began practice. And that was S.N. Goenka, who was a Burmese citizen, uh, ethnically Indian. His mother lived in India, and she was ill. So he got permission to leave Burma and come to India, where she recovered actually. And then he began teaching. So that was an intensive 10-day meditation retreat. And what he taught was 3 days of concentration on the in and out breath at the nostrils only.
Mm-hmm.
And
The
then
nostrils, as he put
And
it.
then exactly. And then what we these days, because of John Kabat-Zinn, call a body scan. He called it sweeping, where you move your attention throughout your body, feeling the changing nature of sensation. So that was my very first practice and was my practice for a long time. It sort of expanded to being mindful of emotions and thoughts, not only through the vehicle of sensations, but in and of themselves. And so I had another teacher named Manindra, and then this woman Deepama. Um, and right in the beginning, my very first retreat, Goenka would end his retreats with like half an hour of loving kindness, almost as a sort of ceremonial way of saying goodbye. And I just kept thinking, what was that one? I want to learn that one. And it was only many years later that I went to Burma in 1985 and did a 3-month period of intensive loving kindness practice.
That was with U Pandita, right?
I was with U Pandita, Sayadaw U Pandita, and so that was my only practice for 4 years, was just doing loving kindness. And then I went back to doing insight meditation, the engine of which is the quality of mindfulness. That's what creates the foundation for the insight. Um, and would do loving kindness just as a uh, sort of non-regimented, what somebody just described to me as microdosing throughout the day. Like uh, an example would be, sitting on a Zoom link and looking at all the faces in the boxes, thinking, may you be happy, may you be happy, may you be happy, may you be happy. Or the way I put it was, I would do loving kindness whenever I was waiting, and every form of transportation is something I counted as waiting, because I was waiting to get to the other place. So it was every airplane, every taxi, walking down the streets of New York, etc. Okay, so that's sort of the main bundle of my practice. Uh, and I found those tools very direct. They're not elaborate. They don't involve a belief system.
Mhm.
You don't have to call yourself a Buddhist or reject anything else. Um, and that's really what I have been teaching for these many years, almost
Yeah.
52 years or something like that. So back to insight meditation, the engine is mindfulness. We're aware of our breath, our sensations, our thoughts, our emotions. And at some point, I found a natural progression where you just kind of become aware of awareness itself. So it's not so much an object. I mean, an example would be in the Tibetan tradition, they talk about our thoughts and feelings being like clouds moving through the sky. Some are light and fluffy, some are ominous looking, but they're all just clouds moving through the sky. And that's really how we begin. We're watching these objects come and go and come and go. And then at some point, it's like you're landing in the sky itself, like the openness, the expansiveness, the freedom of the awareness itself. So that's something I think is a natural evolution in doing practice. And I found that to be the case for me. So it wasn't the case, though, that my Burmese teachers or my Indian teachers were really describing that very much, even way back in the old days where there were almost no books in English. And so if you read something or if you heard a teacher say something, you would write it down in your notebook. We all had our own notebooks. I still have my notebook.
Wow.
Um, and it was only like reading Zen poetry, reading Tibetan or hearing Tibetan teachings. I think, oh, that was the experience I had
Hmm.
that no one seems to be talking about. And so
Not
that,
even Ajahn, not even Ajahn Chah.
well, Ajahn Chah was not one of my teachers.
Right, sure.
He was Jack's teacher.
Yeah.
And that was Thailand. So Jack was having like a parallel life in Thailand while Joseph and I were in India.
Yeah.
studying with Burmese teachers. I only met Ajahn Chah when Jack Cornfield brought him to IMS, to Barry.
Right. And you just said it's not like you could pick like for me, it's like, well, I've read Ajahn Chah, but you were like you were saying there weren't you couldn't just pick up a book of his teachings. Fair
Yeah.
enough. Wild.
Yes. So, and remember, there's no internet in those days.
Hmm.
Like I couldn't
Had
like
to actually go up a mountain sometimes.
exactly. I couldn't Google Ajahn or famous time meditation teachers.
Yeah.
Um, so Zogchen is a Tibetan teaching in predominantly one school, although a few. It appears in a few, and in my experience, it's really very much like that awareness of awareness. Or another way of talking about it is insight meditation. It's called insight because it brings us to a more profound understanding of the three characteristics of life, the universal characteristics of life. That's impermanence, and it's both faces of impermanence, the kind of glorious, beautiful, wonderful sense of things beginning and springtime and renewal and openings, and the more poignant sense of impermanence. Everything's fleeting. I can't hold on to anything. Look at the fragility of life. I mean, next year, the Insight Meditation Society is celebrating its 50th anniversary.
Wow.
And we kind of go around like any older people, like, where did those years go? So that's a
Yeah.
part of the insight into impermanence. The second characteristic is dukkha, or suffering, not just like painful interludes or injury, but the insecurity, the uncertainty of life. And so it's got like layers of meaning. And then the third insight is into anatta, or emptiness, or no kind of independent self. And as a body of teaching, Zogchen teaching is really about that third, more predominantly than anything. It's about the emptiness of everything, the dreamlike nature of all of our experience, and um, much more than kind of the languaging around suffering and so on.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is really interesting to me, Sharon, like hearing you describe it as a natural evolution. And I wanna like scratch at that and see if we can dig a little deeper because it leads me to wonder, well, then how come why didn't you hear Deepa Ma or Munindra or Mahasi or U Pandita or these great Burmese Vipassana masters who whose practices were so deep? I mean, would you say that your suspicion is that they were landing in these states and just not talking about them so much? Or like is are you saying that you think that like do enough Vipassana practice and it's kind of inevitable that you end up doing Dzogchen?
Yes, but you may
Huh.
not do it as a systematic undertaking. And also, like lots of systems language things differently. And the first of all, in the original Pali suttas, the teachings of the Buddha, if you're talking about a state of the unconditioned, the Buddha used what we call unlanguage, the unborn, the undying, the unconstrained, the on everything. So
Mhm.
this is the ineffable. You always go. It's like you get tied up in knots. Yeah, I say the ineffable experience, but it's not an experience.
Mhm.
You know, um,
Yeah.
and so I once told somebody that I wanted to write a book on uh, nirvana, or freedom, or the unconditioned state. Well, it's not a state. And they said, "Oh, you want to be ineffable?"
Huh.
So there's that. Where is the language? There's a little bit in the suttas about consciousness and that has no place to land and things like
Right.
that, But the other thing that I found characteristics and absolutely essential for me as a student um, was that a lot of the Theravadan teaching is about the problem, you know,
Yeah.
greed, hatred, delusion, fear, jealousy, the suffering that they cause when we're immersed in them, when we're lost in them. And that's where I was at.
Mhm.
And so like if you look at the list of the five hindrances in the Theravadan system, it's grasping or attachment, aversion, anger or fear, sleepiness, restlessness, and doubt. And these five hindrances are talked about a lot because these are not only common in meditation, but they're very common in life, right?
Yeah.
And so understanding their nature, seeing new ways of being with them so we don't get so lost in them, at the same time not hating our experience or ourselves for having them. That's such a big part of the practice. So then sitting with a Tibetan teacher, studying Zogchen, they talk about hindrances, three hindrances that can be hold you back, that can be limiting in your practice. And that's clarity, bliss, and non-thought,
Mhm.
which is
The
true.
yams. Yeah.
We can get into those states and they do hold us back because we get attached to them. But I kept thinking, what happened to sleepiness? What happened to anger? And so I think for me and for many, it's another reason that I teach in that style, of the Theravada, is that that's people's actual experience. And it's very important to recognize that.
Hmm. You feel like that's more what they need, the same way that it was what you needed at a point in time.
I think for many people, and I mean, I just don't hold these things in comparison, I guess, People are also
Yeah.
drawn, they feel, personal connections to different styles, different teachers. And
Yeah. But it is an interesting question why, as someone who now feels such a connection with Dzogchen, you still teach mainly in the Theravada, but I guess,
I
you just
teach
answered
only in
that
the
it,
Theravada. Yeah.
but what do you say?
I teach only in the Theravada.
Yeah, you teach only in the Theravada. Does that have anything to do with, I don't know, not being Tibetan or not being a reincarnate Lama or not being like sort of in a lineage in a more traditional way? Like, does that have anything to do with it, or is it purely just about where you feel people mainly are and what you want to give them, or what's the reason?
Well, I think it's a lot because I think that's where people mainly are. Part of it is that I was never, I don't know what the word would be. I was never asked to teach in Dzogchen tradition. And,
Sure.
is that because I'm not Tibetan? I don't think it depends on some teachers, probably it would matter, but I don't think for the teachers that I know. And also, it's not easy to teach. It's like back to that thing about emptiness. First of all, they say in the Theravada teaching that of those three characteristics of impermanence, suffering, and non-self, we also could have almost like a kind of personality configuration so that one or the other of those characteristics is our doorway to liberation, and one is
Hmm.
not better than another. So like for me it was dukkha from the get-go.
Hmm.
And I used to hear teachings about non-self or anatta, and I used to think, what are they talking about? And that was in contrast to a friend of mine who I actually met in 1970 in Dharamsala, India. And he said that when he first heard the teachings on anatta or emptiness, he so deeply knew they were true that he said, like the hairs on his body were rising up.
Hmm.
And I said, boy, I just sit there and think, what are they talking about? So that's part of it. And also, it is tricky once you're talking about a non-dual reality, like in all of Buddhism, there's relative and absolute truth, and they don't negate one another. In the world of the non-dual, you could say pleasure and pain. What's the difference? And there's
Right.
no karma, but there's karma,
Mm-hmm.
and so holding like emptiness and also the power of compassion, because in the world of the non-dual, it doesn't matter
Mm.
when misunderstood or taken in a certain way. And so I think it was, I don't know if it was Padmasambhava or Nagarjuna, some great Tibetan sage said something like, pity the person who's attached to material reality, but pity more the person who's attached to emptiness.
Mm.
Because then it's just nihilism. Nothing matters. What difference is it? Does it, not truly, but that's how it's misinterpreted. And when we get kind of lost in that,
Yeah. Yeah.
it's like the
Um,
ultimate up leveling, it's like this
yeah.
spiritual bypass. It's all empty.
Right. I can do whatever I want. Yeah, there are no beings ultimately, so whatever. There's no one to hurt, there's no one to
Right.
be
That's
cruel
right.
to, or yeah. Um, yeah, no, that all makes a ton of sense, Sharon. This is interesting. So, if we could turn in a rather nerdy direction while staying on this sort of general topic of Zogchen, which I'm enjoying so much just because I haven't had the pleasure of hearing you speak on it very much. So you talked about wanting to write a book on nirvana or liberation. And so if we were to get sort of like ticky-tacky and technical, the nature of liberation as understood in the Dzogchen tradition and as understood in the sort of Burmese Theravada lineages are very different. And I don't just mean like as academic experience understandings. I mean like the experience is different, right? So, as my very limited understanding allows, the sort of fruition of the Theravada and Burmese Vipassana practice or practices that you were talking about is, and please correct me if I step off the path here at any point, but that it's what's sometimes called a cessation, right? The experience of nibbana in Pali or nirvana in Sanskrit is understood as sort of everything stopping, conditioned experience stopping, and then coming back. That's when you first experience it is often called, Magapala, or the experience of the path and its fruit. And that you can actually learn to rest in what's called pala or fruition and just sort of hang out in this nibbana, this nothing. Um,
Wait. Who said it was nothing?
Touche. That I thank you very much. You're absolutely right. This cessation of whatever it's a cessation of. Um, but this is very different from the Zogchen experience, the liberated experience in Zogchen, which is often called the recognition of rigpa, or resting in rigpa, or resting in the recognition, which is a state where there is very much still conditioned experience. There's still phenomenal experience is still here. You're conscious in the conventional sense, but there is a non-dual immanent freshness. This subject and object distinction sort of collapses. Everything is vibrantly present in and of itself. But those are two completely different things, right? And so help me understand the these two very different awakenings. Do
Well,
they
I
have
don't think it can be understood with the mind, and it's not a cognitive intellectual analysis, because there's also things within Dzogchen like the ground path, ground consciousness, which seems to more, or the Dharmakaya, it seems to more resemble that Burmese super mundane state beyond
hmm,
consciousness. But then there's also, like a lot of conversation about rigpa. So how do they fit together? I don't know. You know,
yeah.
and the back to something you referred to in a way earlier, it's like the Thai Theravada tradition will more talk about a kind of unconditioned awareness, and the
Yeah.
Burmese will talk more about beyond awareness, but that doesn't mean it's nothing.
Yes, fair
And
enough.
that's why there are no words to describe it, because the normal subject object doesn't exist there. So, um, and those are different, you know, and so uh, this is something I learned for me, not to debate because I don't know, like I can't really uh, say, and these are the kind of arguments people have had forever.
Yeah.
And they say that when the Buddha himself was asked certain questions, like, is there beginning to the universe? Is there a supreme being? His response was to stay silent because, as he put it, or as people say, he lived in disputatious times. He lived in times where people would get into these sectarian disputes. And his concern was, you know, don't do that. Just practice,
Mm.
find out for yourself what's true. And so I like thinking about that because I like the phrase disputatious times because I
Yeah.
think, we live in disputatious times too.
Why, what? Did something happen?
So, I mean, I don't know what to say. Yes, they are described very differently. But then
Okay.
you can expand that question. It's like when I first read Ramana Maharshi and he talked about the self with a capital S. Well, that's really different.
Yeah.
But somehow reading him or looking at his photos, there's just a feeling tone of like, I don't think he's talking about something so vastly different. In fact, if you want to dive into a little bit more, I don't know if you've read Joseph's book, One Dharma.
I haven't read it thoroughly, but I sort of surreptitiously picked it up in the forest refuge when I really should have been practicing. But I somehow found myself in the library, so I've read some passages of it, let's say, probably more than I should have.
I would read it. It's a very small book, unlike his last book, Mindfulness, which was like a brick, but
One of my favorite books of all time, an absolute banger. I love that book. But yeah.
but One Dharma is very small. He wrote it after we went to Nepal in, I think it was 1991. And he was very, very resonant with the Zogchen teachers and teachings. And that was after so many years of being deeply immersed in Burmese practice. And so he wrote that book as the resolution of his own inner conflict, trying to
Mm.
bring those two things together.
Now, but the thing is, I don't believe that, and I'm not saying that you're saying this is the case, but I I I want to believe that there's a way to talk about this stuff, about the differences, about the places where they diverge and converge, um, without it being disputatious, right? I think it's so wonderful that for the first time in history, all these traditions are colliding in what could be a really fruitful and illuminating way. Like it doesn't need to be about, and I know that there have been sort of bickery podcasts about like Zogchen versus Vipassana, which I agree is just seems misguided to me. Um, but to understand the differences is not to suggest that they need to be um, at odds with one another, or sort of the differences need to be sanded away. I'm sure there's a lot to learn from, the fact that there's this. One of my teachers used to call it the Buddha's beautiful garden of samadhis. This beautiful sort of diversity, you know.
That's true, but I mean, then maybe that's a conversation not about some seeming enlightened state, which people may feel somewhat far away from,
Hmm.
but differences in tools, differences in methods, differences in even metaphysics. I mean, that's really Joseph's conclusion, in one Dharma, which was that he began to see all the metaphysics as skillful means, and it's all about not clinging,
Not grasping or clinging.
not
Yeah.
grasping, and so, I mean, you could do it on every level. Are the hindrances uh, inherent, or, are they qualities within us that we're moving away from? Or are they just illusions, illusory states? Or do we have, uh, and people ask this all the time, is loving kindness something that we cultivate, or something that is innate and natural to us that we need to uncover?
Mm-hmm.
And my thought is, what difference does it make? There's work to do,
Yeah.
whether you're thinking that it's to cultivate a state that is in short supply, or it's to uncover a state that's like this wellspring within, but you're not in touch with. There's work to do, So it's like approaching it from the same thing from different angles.
Okay. Well, in that case, um, let's go there. Are there people for whom it makes more sense to practice the more sort of object-oriented Vipassana style of practice and the Theravada Dharma, versus people where it makes more sense for them to hang out in the Dzogchen non-dual Tibetan world? Or is it simply, hey, what moves you,
I'd say it's what moves you, I mean, it's not like a list, of qualities or
Well,
strategies.
those sorts of things exist, right? The Buddha would say, if you're like this, practice this practice. If you're like that, practice that, right? And the Visuddhimagga does that too. There is some role, perhaps, for a teacher to help a person who might not yet understand themselves deeply, right? Make those choices in a thoughtful way.
Yeah, I mean, to some extent that's true, and it's very cute, the stories, but there's one very, I mean, because basically it's about balance. If you're very angry or frightened, do loving kindness. If you're full of lust and desire, do contemplation of death. And then awareness of the breath is good for everybody, and
Yeah.
so they say a teacher would try to match up the student. This is especially in the development of concentration. They would match up the student with the particular form of concentration or contemplation that would help create some balance for their personality. But there's this very cute story about some disciple of the Buddha's had a student, and he had him contemplating something like the loathsome nature of the body, how everything
Hmm.
decays. And there are these meditations where you're reflecting on like pus and bile and, all these things. Uh, and loathsome is probably a bad translation, but it's the one we've got, because you're not meant to have hostility and hatred for the body, but it's a balance to like obsessiveness about, never growing old and things like that. So anyway, he had the student doing that reflection. The student was going nowhere. Like his practice was not progressing. And the Buddha came along and said, oh, for like 500 lifetimes, this disciple had been like a jeweler crafting these beautiful, beautiful objects out of like gold and silver. So the right meditation for him is to imagine like this beautiful, wonderful object and then watch it fade away.
Mm.
Not to do the loathsome nature of the body. And so they say it was only the Buddha who could always get it right, in terms of the particular balancing meditation. So yeah, I mean, I wouldn't worry about that either, because usually it's a question of connection, like uh, does somebody feel that kind of connection with a Tibetan teacher, and interest in that path as compared to some other, and nothing is necessarily for a lifetime either.
Mm. Indeed. Yeah. Sharon, right? That my first real teacher was Sokmi Rinpoche.
Was it?
Yeah, I did my first silent retreat with him. I did my first month-long retreat with him. Yeah. Mhm. And then I ended up finding my way more towards Theravada practice.
Yeah.
Is usually the opposite of how it goes. But yeah. So, all right, I guess my last question on this topic is you sometimes get this claim from folks who are into Dzogchen practice or similar practices that the Theravada practice or the non-Dzogchen uh, practices, are called almost disparagingly, or not almost, just disparagingly, sort of renunciate practices, life denying, essentially smaller in a way than Dzogchen. I'm sure you've caught this vibe before in the way that it's spoken about, that it's limited, it's blinkered, it's someone who isn't able to be with the sort of cosmic vastness of everything, and so needs to shun things and hide from pleasures and the various worldly things. What would you say back to that? That's a case that I've heard made.
I don't think they would make it to me, actually.
No, so I need to be here as their proxy making it.
No,
Um,
when you said what would you say back, so but it's intertwined, this is what attachment is, and if you even aside from Zogchen, like the historical distinctions that are made, the Hinayana and the Mahayana that are
yeah.
made by Mahayana. Mahayana means greater vehicle. Hinayana means lesser vehicle, you know,
Hmm.
and like Theravadan practitioners don't necessarily relate to themselves as lesser in some way, so then people are bending over backwards to try to explain it differently, like, oh, it's just an attitude, it's not a school, or it's just the solitary practitioner thing or whatever,
Yeah.
but it exists within, like we've kind of been pointing to a little bit the Burmese Thai differences, about a number of things, and they're not necessarily talked about or held as gee, we have different perspectives on things, it is like better or worse. So you talked about the
Yeah.
Visuddhimagga, which is this great commentarial work. Visuddhimagga is the path of purification. It's this commentarial work that was compiled, I don't forget, 300, 500 years after the time of the Buddha, something like that. And the Burmese consider it totally authoritative. If you said, this is found in the Visuddhimagga, that would be enough, to really hold it as authentic teaching, whereas the Thais don't think that way. Then they say, it's just a commentary, it's not the actual words of the Buddha, and therefore things that are like more explicit loving kindness instruction is found in the Visuddhimagga, for
Yeah.
example. The only thing you see in the suttas is the Metta Sutta, like pervade the world with, and I've had that conversation with people who are proponents of the um, Thai perspective, and they say, well, all that stuff you teach is wrong, like the phrases and visualizing people. The only thing that's right is just pervade. And I said, what are you pervading? Like,
Mm.
and I said, this is what my teachers taught me. I didn't make it up, one afternoon in Brooklyn or something, so um, they have a lot of differences. And with that vibe, the exact vibe you're describing, this is better than mine is better than yours.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's just an artifact of systems, I guess, or people coming together and identifying. But we have the opportunity as people born outside of that um, to not buy into it, which I think is a very healthy thing. I've also sat in Burma, I don't know, like 7 million degrees out, really uncomfortable physically, and heard interminable lectures about how um like Goenka or the Buddha and the Anapanasati Sutta talked about observing the breath of the nostrils. Mahasi Sayadaw, who you also mentioned, who was sort of the lineage head of the school that like Dipa Ma or Manindra or U Pandita studied and taught in said you can watch your breath with the abdomen.
Mhm.
And I have heard like a million lectures and a million degrees about why it's fine to watch the breath at the abdomen and not just at the nostrils, or it's fine. You can only watch the breath at the nostrils and not at
Mhm.
the abdomen. I'm sitting there suffering, thinking, why am I here listening to this? Like, who cares? Clearly both can work, and uh, so I don't know. It's like that, within systems of thought. And I think we really can be free of that.
Mhm. Here, here. All right. I think that's a nice place for us to shift, Sharon, from a conversation between the two of us to a Q&A. Is that all right with you?
But that's fine.
All right, perfect. Rita, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, I'm Freda. And by the way, I have sat with Sharon a long, long time ago. So I once sat a very short, like Friday, Saturday, with Ruth Dennison in Portland years ago. And I know that her teacher was Uba Keen, who was the same teacher as Goenka. And I never met Goenka or sat at Goenka, but my understanding is they're like night and day, in terms of style. And so I guess my universe is Mahasi, but how did people get so different with the same teacher? I guess that's my question. Or any stories about Ruth too?
Well, people start out differently, like our own conditioning, the way we speak, where we grew up, our personalities, and Ruth is a kind of was a unique character. Like we used to, if you pulled into the driveway at the Insight Meditation Society and you heard tango music coming out of the meditation hall, you knew Ruth was in town teaching, and she'd been through her own experiences. She was very she was in like a Russian prisoner of war camp in the war and escaped because she pretended she was a hairdresser and she was cutting people's hair. She had no idea what she was doing, but they moved her out of the camp to somebody. I don't know. It was just like she had many stories, and she and her husband were sort of they had these salons in Hollywood, in the early days with people like Alan Watts were friends, and she was just like this wild and wacky character, and that was her personality, and Goenka was, a businessman with 5 children and uh, some kind of international, I think, textile business. And he was somebody who was very different. As far as I remember, um, he began meditating because he had these incredibly vicious migraine headaches and he had like a big, big anger problem. And those two things might not have been completely separate from one another, in his mind, but he began meditating and really changed his life. And, also began teaching because his own teacher had told him to teach, as I'm sure Ruth was the same thing. But we start out so differently, then, that's how we all are. Like
Thank you so much.
some of these people say to me, oh, like I had a friend who was looking through this book I wrote called Real Happiness. And he said, oh, you wrote this one in American. I said, well, I am American. I'm a New Yorker. Like, that's how it comes through.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Freda. Thank you, Sharon. Let's see. Next up, Debbie, would you like to ask your question?
I'd like to ask you a question, John, later if you have time. Okay, so Sharon, I do have this question for you. I live in a very destitute community, and I work here. And I was at the local food pantry, and the shelves were empty, like empty, nothing there. I know. I just wanted to run home and like empty my checking account to that food pantry. And in relationship to Donna as well, I don't know how to have practice discernment around generosity and Donna. Like I don't know, like what do I give when I go and you offer me a teaching that's priceless to me, or I don't have any discernment around generosity. I just wanted to go home and take everything out of my own refrigerator, or I'll feel guilty if I buy organic milk and the little kids down the street, are eating generic Fruit Loops.
I mean, we need discernment, and yet, it's not a bad question, I think, to ask oneself, but not harshly, and not feeling we don't deserve to have anything because others are really struggling. But look at the cultural message we get. Like, you're only a worthy human being if you keep acquiring and accumulating and getting and having and possessing. And I think it's not a bad question to ask oneself, like, what do I need right now in order to be happy? And sometimes we're happier because we've given something away or allowed someone else to eat, rather than, as one of my friends said, enough is a feast. That's a phrase that she uses. Enough is a feast. So I don't think it's a bad thing. And it's, not everyone bears witness to the kind of inequity or suffering, the struggles that are really happening. And if you do, because of where you live and where you work, that's a very precious thing too. It's very painful, but it's so truthful. And it can be inspiring to take action. It's not like one person alone is going to solve things, but sometimes there is a strength in numbers, as people come together and try to offer greater balance. And in terms of Dana, it's very hard because it's basically importing an Asian system into Western culture, which is not accustomed to it. And so people, all of us, get into like calculations, like, well, how many people are in the room? And if everybody gave them this amount, that'd be too much, like, so, but it's not a question of calculation. It's just a question of your heart, which includes what you can afford reasonably. Nobody wants to see somebody, or because I am a New Yorker, my comment is always, no, you never give up your rent controlled apartment. Like, you don't have to do things that will, harm your family or create distress in some way, but realizing we can come together and try to make some change because there is too much suffering.
I'm blowing you a kiss. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Debbie. And thank you, Sharon. Let's see what we got next. Okay, looks like it's one for me to ask you. So I'll come up here so you have someone to look at. You've used the words system and systematic multiple times throughout this interview. What are your thoughts on applying theory/practice to systems thinking and systems change?
Well, I think, I don't know that I understand systems theory and systems change, so deeply, but I think that there are ways of looking at the world, ways of analysis, which I think are a very strong complement to the kind of internal changes that we go through in meditation. You left off one of my real books, which was Real Change.
My bad. You're right.
Which actually involves that. So I use the example because it's happened so many times. to me, I've seen so many people get into meditation practice and feel an enormous shift in the way they view others, say people living on the streets. As one person said to me, and it exemplifies many, many people, he said, I was approached by this person living on the streets who asked me for $1, and I gave him $1 because that is my practice. I've always done that. And he said, but this was the first time I've ever looked a person like that in the eye and realized that is a human being, just like me. I mean, I've seen that transformation, and it's an important transformation over and over and over again. But I don't know how often that person, that practitioner, then questions, why are there so many homeless people here in this town? What's the housing policy that's governing the rules and regs? What happens in terms of economic opportunity? What are the factors going into this? That's a whole other kind of analysis of a system. And for very fundamental change, that's the kind of analysis that also needs to happen, even aside from the heart's transformation away from greed, hatred, and delusion. Or I was teaching recently, I was zooming into this course going on at the Garrison Institute, and it was for caregivers. My friends from the Holistic Life Foundation were there physically in place, and I was zooming in. And we were talking about caregiving and resilience and burnout. And one of the participants raised her hand and she said, I'm a nurse. And she said, I get a little uncomfortable with all this talk about burnout because I'm starting to feel like I'm failing in my, resilience training or something. And then she said, I don't know that I'm burnt out so much as I'm experiencing moral injury. So moral injury is the term that's used professionally, for basically what we would call a soul wound. You're in, like, the first time I ever heard it, I was talking to hospice nurses, and they said, sometimes the patient's ready to let go. The physicians are ready to let them go, and the family will not let them go. And so I'm being asked to do things that really go against my own moral compass. And that's the job, is doing them. So we feel that kind of split between our own values and the demands of, say, the workplace. And as soon as she said that, I thought, well, yeah, there is a lot of moral injury going on. That's the systems problem. In order to face systems problems, we do need resilience. We can't be exhausted and overwhelmed and depleted. And, so we need all that kind of personal wherewithal, the sense of being centered and balanced, and all the things that meditation can provide. But it's worth a look, at the systems to understand different ways that problems could be addressed.
Thanks, Sharon. I hope that the asker found that helpful. I'm sure they did. Okay, we've got a few more that are for me to ask. So here we go. Hi, Sharon. Just wondering, when living life, how do you balance living life in the driver's seat and putting in effort to achieve certain outcomes versus going with the flow and seeing what comes up?
I think it's like an intuitive balance because we need both. Being in the driver's seat or having a sense of agency does not mean control, right? It's like we try. It's like, say you have a friend who's doing something terribly self-destructive, and they're really struggling. And you are present, you try, you communicate, but you also realize I'm not in control of this person's decisions. they're choices. I will do everything I can, and there needs to be a kind of letting go, because that's reality. In contemporary language, we'd say, well, don't be codependent. It's not gonna work. But that doesn't mean we go to one extreme or the other, that we don't try, we don't care, we don't make effort, but we can do it with wisdom that says, ultimately, it's not in my hands. I'll do everything I can, and there needs to be a kind of letting go. So whatever we do, there's the unexpected, and it doesn't mean we do nothing. We do what we can do, and we make choices, and we do the best we can. And sometimes it's just some crazy unfolding that we realize, well, I never would have predicted that. I mean, who would have predicted in March 2020, when I came up here to Barrie? I've been traveling all of February in California teaching. I got back to New York. And New York City, March 2020 was a really scary place. And people were starting to get sick, and people's parents were dying. And it was like, nobody knew anything, and the anxiety was skyrocketing. And I was in New York, and March 9th, I made the decision to come up here to Barrie. So the Insight Meditation Society is right through the forest over there. And I have a house here. So I thought, I'll go up to Barrie for 2 weeks and ride this out, and then it'll be over. The center was still open, and, we're congregating. And then I think 3 or 4 days after I got here, since, everything had to close down, I got here on the 14th with my snow boots, thinking I'd be here for 2 weeks. And I was here for 8 months before I ever left. And then the months went by, and then it was like, I never would have predicted this. And so that's also reality. It doesn't mean I don't do anything, or plan, but we can do it with a degree of wisdom and even humility. Like, the snow boots weren't that useful in August, when I was still here.
Thanks, Sharon. Once again, questioner, I hope you found that helpful. I trust you did. Okay, another one for me to ask. You alluded to karma before and the relationship with non-duality. Could you expand on how karma shifts on the path when there is no doing?
I'm not sure that it does shift. I mean, if there's really no doing, that's a different thing. But what people often claim is not doing is still plenty of doing. Emptiness and karma, or emptiness and interconnection, the laws of cause and effect coexist. And I know there's the Zogchen teaching, about there is no karma, but it's tricky, to make that assumption about one's actions. I sort of more myself come back to the relative and the absolute truth. Both exist. And if you think absolute truth wipes out relative truth, you can't live, because nothing matters. Then it becomes nihilism. So maybe in some state you're not creating any karma at all, but I wouldn't count on it as more than poetry.
Cool. Thanks, Sharon. Chappelle, want to ask your question?
Yeah, thanks, John. Hey, Sharon.
Hi.
Um, how effective do you think using the three characteristics as lenses as you go about your day-to-day is for insight? Or do you find like mindfulness to be something that the three characteristics are revealed through. Like if you have enough momentum of mindfulness, they kind of just like appear to be like obvious versus like using those three characteristics as kind of lenses. How do you see that?
My experience was using mindfulness and they would reveal themselves. And like I said, they don't always reveal themselves proportionally. It was a very long time for me before emptiness or non-self felt like a part of my wisdom compared to just some things people were saying. Uh, but I think that's one of the main functions of mindfulness, and it's not often talked about in the West because as mindfulness has gotten popularized, it's been more about another very valuable attribute of mindfulness, which is more like inhabiting your life fully, like not always multitasking, feel the warmth of the teacup and smell the tea and taste the tea and don't be checking your email at the same time. And so it's like life becomes much more vivid and fully lived. And that's really important. But classically, the main purpose of mindfulness is insight, which means these three characteristics. So it's not just inhabiting your life fully, it's really understanding your life. It's being able to look at maybe the things we've been taught forever, like endless accumulation will keep us safe, or vengefulness is really strength, and we get to look directly at them and think, I don't think so. Or maybe we've been taught compassion is really stupid, or generosity is for suckers, or gratitude's for losers, or all kinds of things. But you get to look, what's it like when I'm practicing gratitude? What's it like when I'm practicing generosity? What does it feel like directly? And who am I? Am I really as alone and disconnected as I sometimes feel? Or am I part of this kind of interconnected web? And so mindfulness will bring all that insight. There are some practices, some schools that will do more emphasize like what you described. It's like using consciously one of those characteristics as a kind of perspective on one's experience. It's like with anatta, for example, sometimes, they break down something into constituent elements, like you look at a shirt was the example, and what's the material of the shirt, and is it cotton, and where the cotton come from, and someone grew it and someone harvested it and someone transported it, and you look at the shirt and you see like this big wave of connection of all these elements. I mean, this is, with active imagination, you don't actually study where does the shirt come from, but we break down something into its constituent elements and we see kind of nothing stands alone. That's emptiness. Or you might consciously bring forth this reflection before you try to do something about an unfortunate situation or something that's really painful, is just taking a moment and saying, this is dukkha. I'm not the only one. This is a part of life. This is really suffering. And that's a fine approach. And in some ways, that's a little bit like what U Pandita did with me when I was not when I went to Burma to do metta, loving kindness with him, but when I was the year before practicing mindfulness with him in Barrie. And I went through this whole period. We were seeing him 6 days a week for these like individual meetings to describe our practice and get some feedback. And I went through this whole period, which was really painful in every dimension. And I'd go in to see him and he would look at me and he would say, well, that's dukkha, isn't it? And I'd look at him and I'd think, fix it. Tell me what to do to make it go away, like walk more, sit more, whatever it is. That's all he would say is, this dukkha, isn't it? And I'd leave and I'd come back the next day and I was still suffering a lot, and he would say, "It's dukkha, isn't it?" And I think, yeah, I know that, but like, and every single day he would say, "Well, it's dukkha, isn't it?" And one day I got it. And I thought, oh, that's the beginning. That's the moment where you just say, yeah, this is a part of life. And it hurts. This is dukkha. And then you might think, what can I do about this? And sometimes the answer is nothing, but not always. But still, that's an important acknowledgement. And so we do use kind of conscious reflection in some ways. It's not, particularly my background, which was, like I said, very much let the mindfulness lead the way, and you'll see all these things, but it's a fine way to practice.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chappelle. Thank you, Sharon. Ruth, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, please. Hi, Sharon. It's been a while. Yeah, this is in connection with Debbie's question, that one of the teachings that has always bothered me in this tradition, there's a fair number of them, is giving dana upwards with, like to the monks, to the establishment, because there's an implication that they're going to be wiser on how to deal with it. And the same kind of hierarchy just keeps showing up in a lot of traditions, Buddhist and not, and structures and organizations. Got any suggestions on, like whether it's even worthwhile to discuss it or just act out of, what I think is right?
Well, I think it's always worth discussing something, but you have to act out of what you think is right. I mean, what else can we do? It's a little complicated culturally, and to some extent, the teaching is that if the recipient of your generosity is like ethically pure, or purer than we are, then that's a very noble thing to be contributing to. And so the karma is better, but you don't have to think about that. I mean, the cultural reality is that the Buddha did a very interesting thing when he established the order of monks and nuns, which is he made them completely dependent upon lay people. You're not even supposed to store food overnight. You have to go out every single day going out for alms. And so you're subject to the scrutiny of lay people. You're not allowed to boast. One of the interesting ethical points people make about the Buddha's rules for the monks and nuns is he didn't describe a rule until somebody had already broken it. And so you read those rules and you think that someone did that, like, these weird rules like, a monk should not throw his begging bowl up in the air to get caught in trees. I think, who did that? Or not to do astrology, not to do, magic tricks, because the idea was that you're supposed to accept what's given in terms of food. You're not allowed only to go to rich people's houses or people with better cooks. You have to accept what's given and go everywhere. And so the monks and nuns are totally dependent, theoretically. This is before Buddhism was like a state religion and where people were amassing treasure. It's like they really had nothing, and every single day they had to go out. And so it was considered incredibly noble to support people's practice because they're practicing really for all of us, and their own liberation would be a great boon to the world. And so it's a very reciprocal relationship, and there is that emphasis on providing that support. For sure, it's very different here. And so we have to scrutinize and kind of dissect the teaching and try to see what's right for us and what feels right. But that's why there is that emphasis on giving up, as you giving up upwards, as you describe it. Not because they'll use it better so much, I don't think, but more because of what they've dedicated their lives to. I mean, it's not always easy when somebody is ordained in the West. It's just one example, and they have a strict interpretation of the rules. Not everybody interprets the rules as strictly as others, but they're not allowed to handle money, for example. And I remember once here in IMS, there was some incredible blizzard coming, and a monk was arriving in Boston, which is like an hour and a half away. And we couldn't get him a limo, like a shuttle ride, because he didn't have a credit card. And the company would not allow him to have us pay at the other end, so we had to get someone to drive in this impending blizzard, to pick him up and bring him here. And it's not always easy to figure out. Not every monk interprets things quite that strictly, but a lot of them do.
Thank you. Although with the monks, especially Western ones, they choose their lives and then they tell us how to treat them. And that has always bothered me. I'll be polite, but
a fruitful conversation perhaps for the next time Sharon joins us. But thank you so much, Ruth. I appreciate it. And thank you, Sharon. I think we can maybe sneak one more in if that's okay, Sharon, and then we'll wrap if we can keep it short.
I also want to say something else in response to Ruth, what she just said. What you see here is the difference between somebody feeling they are following the dictates of a tradition, like they didn't decide the rules, and others who feel not so much that, like they're not representing Buddhism, for example. They're maybe teaching methods of mindfulness, for example, but they're not, they didn't choose those rules. And some do interpret it more strictly and others less so, but that's an interesting role too. If you feel you are representing an ancient tradition and seeing what that means,
Thank you, Sharon. Thanks. All right, let's wrap up let's make it quick so we can get Sharon out of here on time. But Jackie, you had a question?
Amazing. Hi, it's such an honor to talk to you. I also asked the question about systems change. But my other question was about, I feel like anytime someone is, experiencing dukkha or just struggling with something in life, whether it's like a difficult, complex decision or maybe like a depressive episode or something, I feel like the recommendation is always to spend more time sitting and just sit on it. But interested to hear your thoughts in addition to sitting or reading, what are other activities or hobbies or ways of spending your time that can build that resilience that you mentioned?
Well, some of that I think is personal, and when people say sit with it, like if you look at the quality of mindfulness, it implies being able to be with what's happening, whether it's pleasant, painful, or neutral, without getting sucked into it and overwhelmed by it, and also without hating it or pushing it away. So it implies a state of balance and spaciousness, no matter what's going on, even if you're looking at something totally crummy. But that's not always so easy, right? So what are the constituent elements of that? If you're not sleeping and you have no energy, and then you're sitting down and you're facing something really painful, it's not going to work, right? You're exhausted, and so you don't have like the wherewithal to do that. And so it's a pretty global look at what conditions help us come to that place of balance, and it will also change at different times. And I'll tell you one story, which your question reminds me of. So this was March 9th, 2020, back to that era when I was teaching this class in New York, in this windowless room in a basement, and anxiety was through the roof. And this was a place where the speaker sits with the group until they're formally introduced. Then you get up on the stage. So I was sitting in the front row, and this woman next to me was like jumping out of her skin with anxiety. I don't know if I should have come. And everybody was like, "Are you going to catch this thing?" And it was just like, so I said, well, there are these breathing techniques, for example, which I've heard about, where there are many variations of it, but like basically if your out breath is longer than your in breath, the parasympathetic nervous system will take over from the sympathetic nervous system, and your nervous system will kind of chill and you get relaxed. She was not interested at all. So then I said, well, there's this loving kindness meditation where, you don't feel so alone, and you feel connected to like the greater whole. She was not interested at all. So then I looked at her and I said, is there anyone you can help? And she lit up and she got really radiant. She said, I have this really elderly neighbor, and maybe I can slip a note under her door and ask her if I can get her groceries or something like that. And I thought, well, look at that. She needed that kind of connection to return to something within herself that was not so frightened and so overcome. And so that can be a big part of it, for a lot of people is reaching out outside of ourselves in some way. And sometimes it feels like it's never enough, and it's never enough, but it's important to do, even if it seems like a very, very small thing. And that will make a difference. As will breathing and doing loving kindness meditation. But she wasn't interested.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Jackie. And thank you, Sharon. Thank you so much for being here with us. Is there anything that you want to say before we wrap up for the evening?
No, thank you. I'm so glad. Behind the scenes thing is that these things are so hard to schedule. So I'm so glad it worked.
Me too. I'm really happy as well. So thank you, Sharon, and everyone who is here, and everyone who's watching this in the future on YouTube. Thank you so much for your time, for your attention, for your practice. I hope you all have a wonderful evening. Thank you so much, everybody. Good night.